There are moments in a nurse's career that define everything that comes after. Moments when you have to choose between following orders and following your conscience. When you have to decide if protecting someone's secret is worth risking your own future. I'm about to tell you about the day I touched a wounded colonel's arm and uncovered a truth so devastating that it nearly destroyed both of our lives. What started as a routine emergency call turned into a military conspiracy, ethical nightmare, and the most controversial decision I've ever had to make. Some secrets are buried for a reason, but sometimes those are exactly the secrets that need to come out. This is my story. My name is Laura Bennett, and I've been a military nurse for 12 years now. I grew up in a small town in Montana, where the biggest emergency was usually a ranching accident or someone's appendix deciding to burst on a Friday night. My father was a veteran, and growing up, I heard countless stories about courage, sacrifice, and the brotherhood of soldiers. Those stories shaped me. They made me want to serve, to be part of something bigger than myself. So when I turned 21, I enlisted and trained as a combat medic. Eventually, I became a registered nurse specializing in trauma care at Fort Bragg, one of the most demanding military installations in the country. The work was intense, the hours brutal, but I loved every second of it. I'd seen everything from training accidents to combat, injuries from overseas deployments. I thought nothing could shake me anymore. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday in late September when everything changed. The air was crisp, fall was settling in over North Carolina, and I was finishing what I thought would be a routine shift in the emergency department. Then the alert came through. Multiple helicopters inbound with casualties from a classified operation. We had 15 minutes to prepare. The entire department transformed into controlled chaos. Supplies were checked, trauma bays prepared, and everyone moved with the precision that comes from years of training and too many real emergencies. When those helicopters landed, the rotor wash sent leaves and dust swirling across the tarmac. I counted 6 stretchers. Most of the injuries were moderate, things we could handle, but there was one patient who immediately caught everyone's attention, a full colonel, uniform torn and bloodied, walking on his own despite a clearly serious arm wound. He was refusing assistance, barking orders at the medics trying to help him. His face was covered in dirt and streaks of dried blood, but his eyes, those eyes were what I'll never forget. They weren't filled with pain, they were filled with something far more terrifying. Pure, undiluted rage, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or guilt. If this story has already captured your attention, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next is going to surprise you even more. The colonel's name was Thomas Whitmore, and within 5 minutes of arriving, he had turned the emergency department into his personal command center. He was ordering nurses around, demanding to know who was in charge, insisting that his injury was minor, despite the fact that blood was literally dripping from his sleeve onto our pristine floor. My supervising physician, Dr. Alvarez, tried to approach him calmly, explaining that protocol required all casualties to be evaluated regardless of rank. That's when Colonel Whitmore did something I'd never seen in all my years of military medicine. He looked Dr. Alvarez straight in the eye and said, in a voice that could have frozen hell itself, "Get everyone out of this room. Now." That's an order. Dr. Alvarez hesitated. We all did. This wasn't how things worked. Medical personnel don't take orders from patients regardless of rank. We have protocols, procedures, ethical obligations. But there was something in Whitmore's voice, something that made it clear this wasn't a request, or even a standard military order. This was a man on the edge of something dangerous. Dr. Alvarez made a decision that I'm still not sure was right or wrong. He nodded to the team and started clearing the room. One by one, my colleagues filed out. The other doctor, 3 nurses, 2 medics. They all left without question. Military training runs deep. When a superior officer gives an order, you follow it, even when every instinct screams that something is wrong. I started to follow them. I made it 3 steps toward the door when something stopped me. Maybe it was my father's voice in my head, reminding me that a nurse's first duty is to the patient, not to rank or protocol. Maybe it was the way Whitmore's hand was trembling as he pressed it against his wounded arm. Or maybe it was something deeper, a gut instinct that if I walked out that door, something terrible would happen. Whatever it was, I turned around and walked back to the examination table. "Colonel," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need to look at that arm. You're losing blood." He spun toward me, and for a second, I genuinely thought he might physically throw me out of the room. His face was contorted with fury, veins bulging at his temples. "I said everyone out," he growled. "I heard you, sir," I replied, already reaching for gloves. "But I'm a nurse, and you're bleeding, so unless you plan to physically remove me, I'm staying, and I'm treating that wound. Thank you for staying with me this far. That shows me you're feeling what I felt when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what's coming next changes everything. The silence that followed my words felt like it lasted an hour, though it was probably only 5 seconds. Colonel Whitmore stood there, chest heaving, his good hand clenched into a fist. I could see the internal battle playing out behind his eyes. Part of him wanted to assert his authority, to force me out like he'd forced everyone else. But another part, maybe the part that was starting to realize how much blood he'd actually lost, recognized that he needed help. Without waiting for permission, I stepped closer and gently reached for his injured arm. The moment my fingers made contact with his sleeve, just above the wound, everything changed. His entire body went rigid, not with pain, but with something else entirely. His eyes, which had been blazing with anger, suddenly widened with what looked like pure terror. His breathing became rapid and shallow. His skin, already pale from blood loss, turned almost gray. It was as if my touch had flipped a switch, transporting him somewhere else entirely. "Colonel," I said softly, trying to bring him back from wherever his mind had gone. "I need you to stay with me. Let me help you." His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. Then, barely above a whisper, he said something that made my blood run cold. "They're dead, all 3 of them, because of me." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I knew I was witnessing something beyond a physical injury. This was psychological trauma manifesting in real time. I'd seen it before in soldiers coming back from deployment, but never this immediate, this raw. "Keep talking to me, Colonel," I said, carefully beginning to cut away his uniform sleeve to expose the wound. "Tell me what happened." As the fabric fell away, I saw the injury. It was a gunshot wound, entry point clean, exit wound messier. But something about it seemed off. The angle was wrong for enemy fire. This looked more like it came from behind him, not from the front where combat typically happens. My training kicked in automatically. I applied pressure to slow the bleeding, reached for gauze and antiseptic, but my mind was racing. This wasn't a combat injury from facing an enemy. This was friendly fire. Someone on his own side had shot Colonel Thomas Whitmore, and, from the look of absolute devastation on his face, he knew exactly who and why. Now I want to know from you, where are you watching this story from? Write it there in the comments. It's incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. As I worked on cleaning and stabilizing the wound, Colonel Whitmore began to talk, not coherently at first, just fragments, phrases that didn't quite connect. The compound, smoke everywhere, Rodriguez screaming, orders from command, bad, intelligence. My hands stayed steady as I worked, but my mind was piecing together a horrifying picture. "Colonel, I need you to focus," I said, preparing a local anesthetic. "I'm going to need to debride this wound and possibly suture it. But first, you need to tell me if there's anything else I should know. Any other injuries, any medication allergies." He laughed then, a bitter, broken sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Medication allergies," he repeated. "That's what you're worried about. Not the fact that I led 3 good men into a death trap based on intelligence that was either completely wrong or deliberately false. Not the fact that when everything went to hell, when we were taking fire from positions that weren't supposed to exist, I made a call that got them all killed." I paused in my work, meeting his eyes directly. "What happened out there?" "The operation was supposed to be simple," he began, his voice hollow. "Intelligence indicated a small weapons cache in a compound. Outside Kabul, 6 hostiles, maybe 8. Light resistance expected. We had a team of 12, best soldiers I've ever worked with. Rodriguez, Chen, and Lawson. They'd served with me for 4 years. I trusted them with my life. We went in at 0300 hours, standard breach and clear. But the moment we entered that compound, all hell broke loose. There weren't 6 hostiles. There were at least 30, and they were ready for us. It was an ambush." He stopped, his jaw clenching. I waited, continuing to work on his arm while giving him space to continue when he was ready. "We were pinned down immediately," he went on. "Communications were jammed. No air support could get to us. I had to make a decision. Stay and fight, possibly losing the entire team, or retreat and leave our wounded behind. I chose retreat. I ordered everyone to fall back to the extraction point." As he spoke, I noticed his uninjured hand was gripping the edge of the exam table so hard his knuckles were white. "Rodriguez, Chen, and Lawson were providing cover fire so the rest of us could get out. I thought they were right behind us. I thought we had time to circle back for them once we regrouped. But we didn't. The compound exploded. Someone, either the hostiles or our own command trying to destroy evidence, I still don't know, detonated the entire structure. My 3 soldiers were inside. The full weight of what Colonel Whitmore had just told me settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. I finished suturing his wound in silence, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just a tragic combat loss. This was a catastrophic failure of intelligence that had resulted in deaths and possibly a cover-up. and now I was the only person who knew about it besides Whitmore himself. When I finally secured the bandage and stepped back, he looked at me with eyes that held a question he didn't need to voice. "What are you going to do with this information?" I should have had an immediate answer. Military nurses are mandatory reporters. If we suspect negligence, misconduct, or anything that could impact operational security, we're required to report it up the chain of command. It's not optional. It's not a suggestion. It's a direct order embedded in our code of conduct. But standing there, looking at this broken man who had just lived through every commander's worst nightmare, I found myself unable to speak those words. "Colonel," I finally said, "I need to finish your treatment. You've lost a significant amount of blood. You need fluids, probably antibiotics, and you should be monitored for at least the next 12 hours. He shook his head. "No hospital admission. I'll recover in my quarters. This doesn't leave this room." "That's not your decision to make, sir," I replied, but my voice lacked conviction. "Your physical health requires monitoring, and as for what you've told me, I have obligations." "Obligations," he repeated, and that bitter laugh came back. "You know what my obligation was, Nurse Bennett?" I checked my chart, so he'd clearly seen my name. "My obligation was to bring my soldiers home alive. I failed. Now command is telling me the mission never happened. Those 3 men never died. They're going to be listed as training accident casualties. Their families will never know the truth, that they died because someone fed us false intelligence and sent us into a trap." I felt my stomach drop. This was worse than I'd thought. This wasn't just about one failed mission. This was about institutional cover-up, about erasing the truth of how soldiers died, about denying their families the right to know what really happened. The next 72 hours were the most ethically tortuous of my entire career. I kept thinking about those 3 families. Did they have wives, children, parents who would never know their sons died, not in a training accident, but in a botched operation based on faulty intelligence? I spent my nights reviewing the military medical code of ethics, looking for some clarity, some guidance on what the right choice was. But every answer I found only led to more questions. If I reported what Whitmore told me, I'd be starting an investigation that could expose a military cover-up. That could be the right thing, but it would also destroy Whitmore, a man already destroyed by guilt, who might not survive the scrutiny. If I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in hiding the truth from 3 families who deserved to know how their loved ones really died. That definitely felt wrong, but it would protect a man who was clearly suffering from profound psychological trauma. By the end of that first week, my decision to say nothing had created a dynamic that felt increasingly inappropriate. Colonel Whitmore requested me specifically for all his follow-up wound care. At first, I told myself it made sense. I was the one who'd treated the initial injury. Continuity of care is important, but it quickly became clear that his reasons went beyond medical necessity. Every time I changed his bandages or checked for infection, he would talk. Not about the mission, not at first, but about other things. His career, his family, his doubts about continuing in the military. I found myself not just treating a patient, but becoming something like a confidant. And that's when the whispers started. Other nurses began commenting on how the colonel always asked for me, how he refused to let anyone else near his injury, how he seemed to wait until I was on shift to come in for his appointments. The implications were clear, and they were ugly. My colleagues thought something inappropriate was happening between us. "Lieutenant Bennett seems to have quite the admirer," one nurse said loudly enough for me to hear as I walked past the break room. "Maybe that's why she's getting special privileges. I wonder what her boyfriend thinks about all this private time with a handsome colonel." I wanted to scream that they had it all wrong, that this wasn't romantic or sexual, that I was trapped in an impossible ethical situation, trying to help a traumatized man while grappling with whether I was betraying my duty by staying silent. But I couldn't say any of that without revealing information that wasn't mine to share. My supervisor, Commander Patricia Hayes, called me into her office on a Friday afternoon. "Bennett," she said, not unkindly, "I need to talk to you about your treatment relationship with Colonel Whitmore. I understand he's requested you exclusively for his wound care." "That's correct, ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "His arm is healing well. No signs of infection." "That's good to hear," she said, "but I'm concerned about the optics of this arrangement. Other staff have expressed concerns. I need to know if there's anything inappropriate happening." "No, ma'am," I said firmly. "My care has been entirely professional." "I understand that," she said, "but perception matters in the military. I'm going to need you to transfer his care to another nurse." I felt panic rise in my chest. If I did that, Whitmore would lose the one person he felt safe talking to. He was clearly dealing with severe PTSD, possibly survivor's guilt, maybe even suicidal ideation. Cutting off that connection could be dangerous, but how could I explain that without revealing what he'd told me? "With respect, Commander, I'd prefer to see his treatment through to completion," I said. "His wound is complex. and I've established a treatment protocol that's working well. Commander Hayes studied me for a long moment. Is there something you're not telling me, Bennett? Everything in me wanted to say yes, to unburden myself of this secret that was growing heavier every day. But I looked at her and said, "No, ma'am, just concerned about continuity of care for the patient." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "Fine, but the moment that wound is healed and you've cleared him for full duty, this special arrangement ends. Understood?" "Understood, ma'am." 3 weeks after the incident, everything exploded in the worst possible way. I was in the middle of a routine shift when 2 military police officers appeared in the emergency department asking for me by name. "Lieutenant Bennett," one of them said, showing me his credentials. "We need you to come with us for questioning." "Questioning about what?" I asked, my heart suddenly racing. "An investigation has been opened into the deaths of Sergeant Mark Rodriguez, Corporal James Chen, and Private Daniel Lawson," he replied. "We understand you've been treating the officer who commanded their final mission. We have questions about what he may have disclosed to you during treatment." The families, I thought immediately. Someone must have questioned the official story, must have pushed hard enough that the military couldn't ignore it anymore. I was escorted to an interrogation room, a small, windowless space that felt deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. Sitting across from me was a lieutenant colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, essentially a military lawyer, and a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as an investigator from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. "Lieutenant Bennett," the JAG officer began, "you're not under investigation at this time, but we need your full cooperation in understanding what happened during a classified operation that resulted in 3 casualties. I've been advised of my rights to consult with a lawyer," I said, falling back on my training. "Before I answer any questions, I'd like to exercise that right." "That's your prerogative," the investigator said, "but I want to be clear about what's at stake here. We have reason to believe that the intelligence leading to this operation was not just faulty, but potentially fabricated. We have reason to believe that Colonel Whitmore was set up to fail, possibly because he'd been asking uncomfortable questions about contract fraud in the region. 3 men died, possibly because someone wanted to silence or discredit their commanding officer." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "If you have information that could help us understand what happened, information that Colonel Whitmore may have shared with you during medical treatment, you have a moral and legal obligation to share it, but you also have patient confidentiality to consider. So I'm asking you to think very carefully about where your duty lies." The next 6 hours were a blur of legal, consultation, ethical wrestling, and soul-searching. The lawyer assigned to me explained that medical confidentiality in the military has limits. If information shared by a patient indicates ongoing criminal activity, danger to others, or matters of national security, the privilege can be breached. But what Whitmore had told me didn't clearly fall into any of those categories. It was information about a past event, about failures, and grief, and guilt. Eventually, I made a decision that I knew would change everything. I agreed to provide a statement about what Colonel Whitmore had disclosed to me, but only under specific conditions. The information would be used solely for the investigation into the operation itself, not as evidence against Whitmore personally. I would not testify against him in any court-martial or disciplinary proceeding, and I would be present when investigators spoke to him, so he would know the information came from me and wouldn't feel betrayed. The investigator agreed. Within 24 hours, I found myself in another small room, this time with Colonel Whitmore sitting across from me. The look on his face when he realized I'd told them was something I'll carry with me forever. Not anger exactly, though that was there, but also relief, and beneath it all, something that looked almost like gratitude. The investigation that followed my disclosure moved with shocking speed. Within a week, it became clear that the situation was even worse than Colonel Whitmore had suspected. I wasn't directly involved in most of the investigation, but through Whitmore, who continued to see me for what had now become as much psychological support as medical care, I learned the horrifying scope of what had happened. The intelligence that had led to the mission, the information suggesting a small weapons cache with light resistance, hadn't just been wrong, it had been deliberately falsified, and the reason was exactly what the investigator had suspected. A defense contractor working in the region had been systematically inflating threat assessments to justify larger contracts, more security personnel, more weapons sales. Colonel Whitmore had noticed discrepancies in their reports. He'd started asking questions, requesting audits, refusing to sign off on requisitions that didn't match the actual situation on the ground. He'd become a problem, so they'd fed him false intelligence about a high-value target at that compound. They'd known the compound was actually a major insurgent stronghold. They'd known it was a trap. They'd sent him and his team into certain death, hoping either Whitmore would die and stop asking questions, or he'd fail so catastrophically that he'd be discredited and removed from his position. What they hadn't counted on was that Whitmore would make the impossible choice to retreat, saving most of his team, and they definitely hadn't counted on a stubborn nurse who refused to leave when ordered. But here's where the story takes another turn, because once I'd provided my statement, once the investigation was rolling. The people responsible for this conspiracy realized they had a problem. I'd become a witness, an inconvenient witness who knew too much. It started subtly. A transfer order came through, moving me from Fort Bragg to a much smaller, much more remote installation in Alaska. It was framed as a promotion, a chance to lead a small medical team, but the timing was suspicious, and the location was clearly designed to isolate me from the investigation. I declined the transfer. Then came the performance reviews. Suddenly, my work, which had always been rated excellent, was being criticized. Minor issues that would normally be overlooked were being documented. My supervisor, Commander Hayes, called me in looking uncomfortable. "Bennett, I don't know what's going on, but I'm being pressured to write you up for infractions I never witnessed. Someone higher up wants you gone. Are you in some kind of trouble?" "I'm a witness in an investigation into contract fraud and the deaths of 3 soldiers, I told her, "and it seems like people want me to either leave voluntarily or be forced out." Her face went pale. "Jesus, Bennett, that's way above my pay grade. What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I'm not going to be intimidated into silence." The final straw came 2 days later. I was leaving the hospital late at night after a double shift when 2 men in civilian clothes approached me in the parking lot. They didn't identify themselves, didn't show any credentials. One of them simply handed me a folder. Inside was a detailed dossier on my family, my mother's address, my younger sister's school, my brother's workplace. Nothing was said explicitly, but the message was clear. The other man finally spoke. "Smart people know when to stop asking questions, Lieutenant. Smart people accept good opportunities when they're offered. That transfer to Alaska looks pretty nice. Fresh start. No complications. You should think about taking it." Then they walked away, leaving me standing alone in the dark parking lot, hands shaking as I held photographs of my family members going about their daily lives, clearly taken by someone following them. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photographs. My mother loading groceries into her car, my sister laughing with friends outside her college dorm, my brother leaving his job at the engineering firm. Someone had been watching them, documenting their routines, making sure I knew they could be reached. By morning, I'd made a decision, but it wasn't the one they wanted. Instead of accepting the transfer or backing away from the investigation, I did something that terrified me but felt like the only option left. I went to the media. Not just any media, but to an investigative journalist who specialized in military misconduct and defense contractor fraud. Her name was Patricia Walsh, and she'd won awards for exposing corruption in military supply chains. I reached out through encrypted channels, using a secure email a friend in cybersecurity had set up for me. We met in a coffee shop 2 hours from the base, somewhere I hoped wouldn't be monitored. I brought copies of everything. My medical notes from treating Whitmore, though with identifying information redacted to protect patient privacy. Copies of the transfer orders. Photographs of the photographs that had been left for me, which I'd had the presence of mind to document. A detailed timeline of everything that had happened. Patricia listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, she sat back and let out a long breath. "You realize what you're doing, right?" she asked. "You're going up against people with serious resources and zero conscience. They've already threatened your family. This will only escalate." "I know," I said, "but 3 soldiers are dead. Their families deserve the truth, and if I back down, now, Whitmore gets destroyed, while the people actually responsible walk away. What do you need from me?" She smiled. "A brave ally. Let's burn this thing down." The next 72 hours moved faster than anything I'd experienced. Patricia's article dropped on a Thursday morning, simultaneously published online and in print. The headline read, "Defense Contractor Corruption Led to Soldier Deaths. Military Attempted Cover-Up." The article laid out everything: the falsified intelligence, the mission that was designed to fail, the 3 men who died, Colonel Whitmore's attempts to expose fraud, the investigation that had been opened, and my role as a military nurse who'd refused to be silenced. My phone started ringing before I even got to work. My commanding officer, the hospital administrator, the base public affairs office, the Department of Defense Inspector General, and to my surprise, several members of Congress whose committees oversaw defense spending and military affairs. I was immediately placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into whether I'd violated patient confidentiality or disclosed classified information. Patricia had been careful about what we included in the article, running everything past lawyers first. But the military still needed to review whether I'd crossed any lines. That same day, the families of Rodriguez, Chen, and Lawson received copies of the article. By evening, all 3 families had issued statements demanding a full investigation and accountability for their sons' deaths. The pressure on the military to act became impossible to ignore. But the people behind the conspiracy weren't done fighting. Within a week, character assassination attempts began. Anonymous sources claimed I'd had an inappropriate relationship with Colonel Whitmore. Other sources suggested I was mentally unstable, seeking attention, fabricating stories. One article in a fringe publication suggested I'd been fired from a previous position for incompetence, which was completely false, but still spread across social media. My family started receiving threatening messages, nothing actionable enough for police intervention, but enough to make everyone constantly afraid. My mother called me crying, saying maybe I should just let this go before someone got hurt. It was the lowest point of my entire life. The resolution, when it finally came, wasn't the dramatic courtroom victory you see in movies. Real justice is messier, more complicated, and rarely completely satisfying. But it was something. 6 months after that article published, 3 executives from the defense contracting company were indicted on fraud charges. 2 mid-level military intelligence officers who'd helped falsify reports were court-martialed. Colonel Whitmore was fully exonerated and received a commendation for his attempts to expose corruption, though the trauma of losing those 3 soldiers never left him. He eventually retired from active duty and now works with veteran mental health organizations. The families of Rodriguez, Chen, and Lawson received full disclosure about how their loved ones really died. The military issued formal apologies and established a memorial in their honor at Fort Bragg. It wasn't enough, nothing could be, but it was acknowledgement of the truth. As for me, the investigation into my conduct concluded that I'd acted appropriately under extraordinary circumstances, but my career in military nursing was effectively over. The people I'd exposed might have faced consequences, but they still had allies. My name was too controversial, too associated with scandal. Transfer requests were denied, promotions stopped. I was effectively frozen in place, tolerated but never truly welcomed back. So after 12 years of service, I made the hardest decision of my life. I resigned my commission and left the military. Today, I work as a civilian trauma nurse at a hospital in Virginia. I'm no longer part of that world of protocols and rank and classified operations. But I think about that day constantly. The day I decided to stay in that room when everyone else left. The day I touched Colonel Whitmore's wounded arm and felt him break under the weight of guilt and trauma. The day I chose truth over safety. People ask me if I regret it, if I'd do it differently knowing what I know now. The threats to my family, the end of my military career, the months of stress and fear and uncertainty. And my answer is always the same. I think about Maria Rodriguez, Mark's widow, who told me that knowing the truth about how her husband died gave her the closure she needed to finally grieve properly. I think about James Chen's parents, who said that understanding their son died fighting corruption rather than in a meaningless accident made his sacrifice mean something. I think about Daniel Lawson's young daughter, who'll grow up knowing her father was a hero who died because he served with honor, not because someone made a mistake. And I think about Colonel Whitmore, who carries his guilt and trauma, but no longer carries it alone, who's now helping other veterans work through similar pain. Was it worth it? Every single consequence, every threat, every sleepless night. Yes, 1,000 times yes, because that's what being a nurse means. It means staying in the room when everyone else leaves. It means touching the wound even when the patient pushes you away. It means fighting for the truth even when powerful people want you to stay quiet. That one touch, that moment of connection with a wounded, traumatized man, changed the entire trajectory of my life. I lost a career I loved, but I kept my integrity, and some days, that has to be enough. Now I want to know what you think about all of this. Was she right to stay in that room when everyone else left? Should she have protected the colonel's secret or exposed the truth? Write your opinion there in the comments, because stories like this don't have easy answers, and that's why they're so important to share. If this story made you reflect on loyalty, ethics, and the impossible decisions that healthcare professionals face, subscribe to the channel to follow more real accounts like this one. And don't forget to watch the next recommended video, because there's another nurse's story that's going to move you even more.